Today on the Girldefined show, we are talking about whether or not single Christian women should pray for their future husbands. That is something that I did. I literally wrote an entire box of prayers and letters to my future husband, hoping, dreaming, praying that one day this man would come into existence and I could gift him these letters. And now as a woman who's been actually married for several years, I look back and I'm like, was that the best idea? Is that biblical? Like, is this a good thing for single women to do? I mean, you think praying, like, of course it's always good to pray, but is it actually good to pray for a man that may or may not exist? Let's jump in.
Hey, sisterhood. It is Kristen and Bethany
What's
here.
up, y'all?
We are sisters and so pumped that you're joining us for this conversation because for us, this is kind of like full circle.
Yeah.
When we first started Girldefined, we talked a lot about praying for your future husband, the power of praying for him, strategies to pray for him, 5 ways to pray for him, a free download to pray for him. I mean, we had it all. This is probably like 8, 9, 10 years ago. And we've had a lot of time to think. In fact, I am coming on 13 years of marriage, which is crazy. So even back then when we started Girldefined, I had only been married for a couple years and I was fresh off of that, like dating, before that, praying for my future husband. And so as time has gone on and we've talked to a lot of single women and just reevaluated our own hearts and our singleness and this whole idea and this kind of cultural Christian push for single women to pray for your future husbands, we've had some conversations and we're like, you know what? We think a little bit differently about this now than we did 10 years ago. And the advice that we would give to single women now isn't exactly the same as it would have been a decade ago.
I mean, it's so hard when you're single. You desperately long for this, marriage, this relationship, this closeness, which is a good desire. That's what we want to emphasize. Like, it is good to desire marriage. God created us that way. We talked about this, we've talked about this so much. Like, if we didn't have those sexual longings and that pull, like, what would drive you to marriage? Like, God created us with that pull so that we actually move toward that relationship. But it can be so hard when you're like, I don't know if that will happen. And nowhere in scripture does the Bible ever guarantee that marriage will happen for every person. Yes, it is his norm. And most people, statistically, and just the way the world keeps on operating and the next generation comes into existence, marriage is, on the table for most people, but it's not a guarantee. And so how do we approach this conversation of asking ourselves, is it a good thing? And is it right? And is it a good use of our time? Especially to those that are single, obviously, to spend time writing letters, to spend time praying for, this man, to spend time, like, is that a good idea? And I know we both talked about how we did this. I'm trying to think, where did we hear this idea?
Okay, so I remember first hearing about it. We were at a summer camp, a Christian summer camp through our church. I think I was like 13 years old. And I remember one of the leaders talking about, like, the female leaders sharing with all of us girls how she had prayed for her future husband and how it was a really great idea as a single woman. And granted, I'm like, can't even be considered a single woman yet.
You're like 13.
But still, I think she was it was so well-intentioned, like inspiring us. Like, if you're going to get married, he's out there. Why not start praying for him right now? Which is a very valid point, which we're going to get into, because I know right off the bat, you might be thinking, like, why are we even talking about this? Of course, this is a great idea to pray for your future husband, but there's more that we want to unpack here. So I remember hearing that and being so inspired and thinking, yes, I'm going to start doing this today. And I remember getting a 3x5 little card, like those little, lined note cards. And I remember writing out a prayer, like, dear Lord, I pray for my future husband. I pray that he would be a godly man, that he would love you, that wherever he is in the world right now, because he's alive somewhere, it's like that thought you have, right? A single woman, like, he's out there somewhere. Where is he? And, I pray for him right now. And I remember writing this card. And at the time in my life, I had a little prayer box. It's how I would keep track of my prayer requests, my prayer cards, before I used an app because there were no cell phones back then. And I had all my prayer cards. And I remember adding it to my box and praying that prayer card for at least a decade.
Wow.
I mean,
so
I got married.
It was the same.
It was the same card, but as time went on, I added to it. I added more prayer cards. I added more prayers. I changed my methods to journaling and things like that. But it was something that I thought of a lot and thought about a lot. And so for me, it was just kind of like a habit, a norm. And I thought, like, this is a really great thing to do. I know you kind of, I feel like you were even more involved. Like,
it was more dedicated.
I don't think I ever wrote the letters.
Really?
I mean, I journaled a ton. Like, I was, remember
I
my diaries?
letter lady. I
remember my diaries.
Yes. Oh, you were the diary lady.
I never missed a day for like 15 years straight.
Yeah.
Like I would like write in my diary, my journal every single day. And praying for my husband, like talking to the Lord about my future husband was very much a part of that.
Yeah.
But like letters to him, I'm trying to remember.
So I definitely did that. And I can't remember where I heard that, but I definitely was inspired to do it. It wasn't just an idea I had. And the idea was that you would write all these letters, and they weren't just letters like dear future husband. They were prayers. They were it was all encompassing. And so I wrote.
Was the idea like one day you're going to give these to your, okay. Yeah. So one day you're going to give your husband like this box of letters.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's, when it happens and it all works out the way that eventually you want, it's this super inspiring, oh my goodness, look at this godly woman, look at these prayers for her future husband. And it's just like, like it's really comes across as so beautiful and so amazing. And everyone, especially if you post like a reel or talk about it. And I've done that before. And it's been so like, oh my goodness, this is like the dream, because eventually that did become a part of my story. But as I think back, writing these letters, I probably wrote them, for like, starting at 14 to maybe, 30 when I got married.
Wow.
So,
15
so like
plus
15
years.
plus years. And I have this whole, and I've given it to Dave. And so he does have it. And we've actually read through some of them together. And it is kind of bizarre, like looking back and reading these and hilarious to see this young Bethany writing these letters. And there Dave is. But it's just so, it's really sweet and stuff because we have these fun, prayers and thoughts that I had and we're experiencing them together. But I think of myself as like that 14, 15, even then 21, 25, 28, and I wasn't getting married. And I just look back and I'm like, like was that knowing at that time I didn't have a ring on my finger. I didn't know who my future husband was. And I spent a lot of time thinking and wondering and, longing and just hurting too. Like, I don't have this thing in my life. I don't have this person. And it was so hard. And I just wonder if spending so much time focusing on this potential, thing that could happen in my life, but it also could not, but praying about it like it will happen was healthy for me. Because I know a lot of single women really struggle with contentment, with purpose, with thriving, and not, just like, oh, will any guy ever notice me? Well, maybe him, always on the lookout. You go into a coffee shop and you're like, maybe him, anywhere you go, you're always looking out. And I just wonder if some of these habits that were started by, I'm sure, well-meaning Christians and that we perpetuated, obviously, like, are these really the best advice for single women? Another thing I remember, which is really interesting as we're talking about this, is kind of in that same circle of advice, was that if you started to date someone or like court, whatever, that when you were having any physical interaction, they wanted you to imagine that your future spouse was like their eyeballs were like right there, like they were there watching. And so whether it was this person or someone else, and that was a way of like keeping your boundaries in check, accountability. And again, I look back at that at the time, I was like, oh my goodness, that's so honoring. That's so amazing. Like you're just, you're doing all this and you're saving yourself for this person. But when I look back and think of that advice too, I'm like, well, what is the motivation in that? Like, should you be doing that specifically for a person or ultimately to honor the Lord? Like, should you be living and like honoring this person, but also honoring like, God, I want to live this way in integrity for you first and foremost, not because I want, just because I have this like, oh, my person in the future. I don't know. There's just so many ideas that I wrestle with now where I'm like, was this the best idea? So that's, it's a conversation.
And I think that is a great way to ask it. Like, is it the best? Because I think what we're talking about here we're not drawing a hard line in the sand and saying this is wrong and sinful and this is right and godly and righteous, right? Like it feels a little more nuanced than that. Like that's why we're having this conversation, because it's not just something I think you can throw a blanket statement. Like even your example with, imagine your future spouse. Well, a lot of people could take that as, wow, that's actually really inspiring and encouraging me to think about the fact that this person I'm with, I'm not married to. So it is good to think about how I'm treating them, how I'm interacting with them. Like, am I honoring the Lord? Would my future spouse be honored by this? But then there's that pitfall of like, well, what's the motivation?
Yeah.
Is it just because your future spouse, like about them? Or is it truly cultivating a heart of worship and like genuine purity, caring for this person that you're in that relationship with in that moment, trusting the Lord, seeking counsel? Like, so it is very nuanced. And I think, so I want to say that up front and say that I think there could be some positives, right? For praying for your future husband as a single woman. I look back on that and I don't necessarily regret it. Like, oh, I wish I had never done any of that. But what I look back on and wish is that I had spent more of my time focusing on becoming the right woman of God, rather than focusing so much time and attention and thought and emotion and prayer, but a lot of emotions and like desires wrapped up in that, praying for this man, you know, like wanting this godly man, and not as much focus on, but what kind of woman am I becoming? And I don't know what the future holds. Yeah. And I think that's one of the huge pitfalls, is that, you know, like, you didn't get married till 30. Well, what if you never got married?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? What if you never got married and you have all of these letters, all of these journals, all of these prayers that you have been pouring your heart into for years, for 15 years, you know, plus it would be more if you never got married. And what would be the reaction to the Lord in that? Yeah. Would it be like, God, you didn't hold up your end of the deal? I'm not saying you would respond this way, but like the temptation could be, where's my man? Like, I've been praying for him. Where is he, Lord?
And I think that takes us back to the whole conversation we had with all the stuff with I Kiss Dating Goodbye and the Josh Harris conversation. We did an entire video on that. So if you go to our YouTube channel, YouTube.com/Girldefined, you'll see that video. And a part of that conversation, so I actually had like an hour-long phone call with Josh Harris, because we were talking about being in his documentary that he was going to have on I Kiss Dating Goodbye, you know, purity culture, all of that.
This was before he kind of came out and said, like,
he's no longer a Christian. Yeah, it was
right before that.
And he had asked us to be in his video. And when we were talking, he was telling me that he was, at that time, I was totally single, and I was actually like content and thriving in my singleness, and really like I didn't feel like his books had scarred me, or like I was just so miserable, like God was holding out on me. I'd come to a point where I really was learning to trust God and thrive. And what was interesting is that he was telling me that was not the norm in his conversations and in his experiences with the work that he did with I Kiss Dating Goodbye and all of that, what he kind of became known for. He was saying that the majority were women who felt like they had been, I guess, like tricked. I don't know, like, okay, live this life and then God will give you this, you know, reward. And a lot of them, it didn't happen. So they were like, God, I gave you my best. Why didn't you give me your best? And I didn't feel that way at that time. And he was like, oh, this is really interesting, because most women do feel this way. And it was kind of like eye-opening to me, like, you know, this is why we have to be careful about the messages that we share with other Christian women. Like, we have a responsibility in this, because if we are presenting this idea, like, yes, pray for your future husband. If you are just this godly woman, you know, it can come across almost like when you give God your best, when you do your best, then you will get that future husband one day. And we can also translate that into, okay, on my timeline, he will be this kind of man. Yes. Everything will be and it's like, no, none of that is actually guaranteed. And so that's why it's important for us to actually say, what is true? Does scripture say this anywhere, and what's not? And I was just thinking, like, okay, when we look to scripture, what does God actually call single people to? Yeah. Does he call them to pray for their future spouses? Like, I can't recall any verses.
You missed that one in the Psalms.
No, but seriously, you know, like there could easily,
there's verses, right, that talk about for single women to not stir up love, right? In Song of Solomon, to not stir up or awaken love before it's time. I think that's talking more about like sexual purity and not stirring up sexual desires before you're, you know, in marriage and you can fulfill them.
I mean, there's Proverbs where it talks about the wife, though, she does him good all the days of her life. I used to take that as, okay, and it might still, I think it's still like a good thing, but I don't know the biblical grounds of it, of saying like even in singleness she does him good.
Those are part of her days. Even though she's not married
yet. There's that idea that scripture can kind of play into it, but we don't see any specific commands for single people to basically like live as if their spouse exists and they need to be praying and, you know, like battling for this future spouse, like in prayer, like, oh, I just have this sense that something's going on in his life. I'm just going to be in prayer for him. He could be, you know, in New York. He could be, I say New York, because you have a New York shirt on. I'm like, what state can I think of? You know, he could be in Germany, wherever, you know, he could be somewhere across the world. And I just need to, I don't know what's going on in his life right now, Lord, but I just pray for him. You know, we kind of come up in some ways. I think it can become a little like superstitious and almost like we don't know. So, this is why I want to take like a big step back and really like think about what is a better focus for single women that truly will set them up for a life of thriving and purpose and true pleasure and satisfaction in the Lord, whether a man ever enters that picture or not. And for me, as I look back on my singleness, I tell you that when I was talking to Josh Harris and I was thriving and really content in my singleness, it hadn't always been that way. I had to get to this point of truly asking myself, do I trust the Lord? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, where it says, trust in the the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your paths straight. And then we have that other passage where it talks about how in God's presence there is fullness of joy. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. And so it's just this whole idea of in this moment, in that moment of being singleness where I didn't have a ring on my finger, I wasn't in an intentional serious relationship at that point. I was just single Pringle Bethany. What should the focus of my heart be? And I think that scripture guides us to trusting in the Lord in that season fully and completely, trusting that, okay, if I'm single, I need to live fully and completely as a single woman and I can thrive in this. And I need to know that ultimately, whether I have a man or not, ultimate satisfaction is found in God's presence, like through prayer, through being in the word, through fellowshipping with other believers, like the plan that he has set out for us for being in communion with him, whatever you want to call it. And so I think there are so many better, what do you say? Like so many, there are much better things we could be doing with our time rather than focusing and praying and kind of dreaming and hoping and wrestling with this thing that may or may not come into existence. So I really like how you talk about we should focus on becoming the godly woman rather than just pining after the godly man we hope for.
Okay, so I have a question, which I think a lot of people are going to be wondering. Do you regret all of the letters that you wrote and the time you spent on those? Like looking back and even having given them to Dave, what do you think about that?
I don't regret it. It's not like a regret. Like I sit around thinking about it. I honestly don't think about it that much. And here's what's really funny. This is what's so
Tell
funny.
us.
Okay. This is really funny to me. It's that there are so many letters, y'all, because I said like 15 years.
How many are we talking? Was it once a week, once a month?
I
once
have
a
no
year?
idea. Probably when I was lonely.
So was it like a shoebox full?
It's like this little
bin?
container. It's like this metal container thingy.
Okay. Like the size of a shoebox maybe?
Yeah,
Okay.
something like that. But I think that's part of it too. Like when you're lonely, it's almost you create this, you're almost like your own romance.
Almost like a little fantasy
fictional
world.
Yes. A lot of it. And you enter into that, like you're feeling lonely. So you enter into that and you almost write your prayers, but it's like you're kind of like hoping into this future thing.
Like
but
pouring your heart out to this man versus even pouring it out to God.
It's like that kind of is it.
Yeah.
But okay, so I don't regret it. But the funny part is that there are so many that he hasn't even read them all.
Dave hasn't even read all the letters.
No. And so, because when I gave it to him, I literally forgot for like a year after we got married. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I have all these letters for you. And so what's funny is that like once we actually got married, all of the letters and stuff, like it became less of like this thing that I thought it would be.
Moment.
Because it's like half the time who I imagined I was writing to in those different seasons of life. It's like I had no idea. And he's like, I wasn't writing these letters or thinking of Dave, so in some ways it's almost like disconnected and like, I mean, it kind of goes along with the story of how I bought a wedding dress when we went wedding dress shopping for Kristen.
About that.
Yeah, it's kind of the same. So she went wedding dress shopping when she got engaged. I was totally single as a Pringle, as we've already established.
We talk about this whole story in our book, Not Part of the Plan. The book opens with this story of Bethany buying a wedding dress as she's single while I'm wedding dress shopping, and it was hilarious.
So I bought this dress, this $1,000 dress, because it was like at the time, I was in my early 20s, like 22 or something. And it was my dream dress. I was like 20. I have no idea how. Early 20s. Dream dress. And I'm like, I'll never find it again. So I buy it. Like $1,000 dress. The lady, you're supposed to give like your wedding date when you buy a dress and stuff. And I didn't have one. I'm like, just like pretending like maybe.
I'm still working on that.
Still working on the date. But what's crazy, this is why it connects to these letters, is that I bought this dress in that season, imagining like, oh my goodness, of course this is the dress I would die to walk down the aisle to my future husband in. I mean, that's why I'm a hardworking single woman and I'm willing to fork over $1,000 on my own. Like back then that was even more, like that was a lot for a young single woman. But then 10 years later, 8 years later, whatever, when I actually met Dave, I couldn't even imagine walking down the aisle to him in that dress. It didn't represent me and our relationship in that season. It just was like, this does not like reflect.
It wasn't his personality. It wasn't he would even like.
And it wasn't like us together. It just felt off and weird. And so I ended up getting a completely different dress that I absolutely loved, that really represented like what I felt like our relationship was. And it felt like that's what I want to walk down the aisle to Dave in. And so all that brings us back to these letters. Like half these letters I wrote almost feel like that dress. Like who were these for and what was this to? Because it doesn't even really feel like it was for Dave.
Yeah, it couldn't have been.
Yeah, like some imaginary person. And so
interesting.
And that's why it's not like this huge priority. Like we just need to sit and we're just like weeping over how beautiful these letters are.
Because he's like, I'm so disconnected. Like you don't even know I existed.
I mean, he thinks it's sweet. No, he appreciates it, but we were reading them together because we thought that would be so sweet. But it's just not this priority. Like let's pull out the letters again. It's just kind of like, it is what it is. And it was fun to read through a few of them, but it's just not something, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
no,
like a huge
I
priority.
relate to that. And when you were saying the thing about like the fantasy world and how it's almost like a way to, like a spiritual way to escape your singleness where it feels very godly. Like I'm praying for my future husband. And I remember doing the same thing, not with the letters, but even with the prayers of like having intense longings for marriage, like in my later teens, early 20s, like I want this so bad. And so praying for him, almost like willing it into existence. And in my heart, there was definitely a lack of trust in God,
For
even
sure.
in that act of like escaping to dream about this man. But like, oh, but I'm not just obsessing or idolizing, I'm praying, you know? And I'm not saying that's what it is for everybody. Like we all have our own experiences if you've done this, and you might have a completely different story. We're just sharing ours and kind of where our thinking is on this today. But I will tell you another pitfall for me looking back that I can see from practicing praying for my future husband, obsessing over him, getting very emotionally attached to this idea of getting married without knowing if it would ever happen. There are no guarantees. Yes, the majority of people get married. You already mentioned the statistics, but is it God's plan for you? You don't know when you're single. All you know is what's true for today. And that is that I'm single and my job is to glorify God, right? My job is to worship him and glorify him with my life, to serve him with my life. I don't know if I'm going to get married. So spending so much time, what it did for me is I think in my heart, it built a small idol of marriage. And we've already talked about this at the beginning, and we have an entire book called Girldefined, Embracing God's Vision for Lasting Love and Satisfying Relationships, talking about what is biblical love, what is biblical marriage, like dating in a way that honors God. How do we do that? Like these are really important topics. Marriage is hugely important and extremely awesome, and something like we've already said that God designed, but it can become an idol.
For sure.
And it can very quickly become an idol when you're a single woman and you're longing for it, and all your friends are getting married. And I remember for me wrestling in my heart with the fact that marriage, it had become an idol. I didn't see it at first, but I think part of what fueled that idol, honestly, is the time I spent thinking and assuming and praying for my future husband as if I knew 100% he was going to happen. So it was like, yes, God, marriage is going to happen. I don't know your plan, but this is mine and we're on the same team, right? Yes, 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 marriage is going to happen. And so I like elevating marriage in my life as a single woman to a place where it was idolatry. It wasn't even just, Lord, this is a wonderful, beautiful thing. If it's in your plan for me, would you bring a godly man into my life in your timing? But I trust you. I'm surrendered. Like that wasn't my heart posture in those early days. Like I would say late teens, early singles, it was very much that marriage had become an idol.
When you say idol, like what do you mean?
Like something that I kind of demanded in my heart. Like, this is something that you are going to give me, God. I don't think I ever verbalized those words in my prayers to the Lord, but in my heart, my posture was, this is something that you are going to give me. And you're going to give it to me soon, preferably in my early 20s when I want it. And all I have to do is just keep praying for him. And, he's going to, any day now, he's going to pop up. Like, it wasn't a heart posture of surrender, but a heart posture of demand, if that makes sense, of like assuming God's plans rather than humbling myself before God and saying, not my will, but yours be done. And I trust you with that. So that's another pitfall that I'm seeing. And I'm also like, I want to kind of full circle on this because I had a conversation recently on the podcast with Candace Waters.
Oh, yes.
And the title of the episode was Get Married, What Single Women Can Do to Help It Happen. And the entire conversation was not about praying for your future husband, but it was an intentional conversation about the fact that as single women, many of us, and same for me in my singleness, you have these desires, these longings that are good, but they can become idolatrous. Like you've got to keep the balance of trusting the Lord while desiring this good thing. But her whole point was, as single women, in a heart posture of surrender and trust, there are things we can do to intentionally prepare for marriage. We don't have to act like in our singleness, well, I don't know if it's ever going to happen, so I'm not even going to think about it. Like it would be ungodly to think, to even plan, it's like, no, that's not the point of this conversation. And in my conversation with Candace, she was saying there are godly things that single women can do to prepare for marriage. And one of the biggest ones was grow in your own relationship with the Lord. Like grow into a godly woman, asking the Lord to change you, ask him to use you. Like, how are you serving him? How are you getting in the word? How's your worship first and foremost? Like grow into the godly woman that you know God is calling you to be. So if he brings a man into your life, you'll be ready. Like your heart and your maturity will be at a place where you can actually get married and be a blessing to them. And so I just want to say like there's balance here in that there is a way, a God-honoring way to prepare for marriage, to plan for marriage, to even be intentional about getting in a church where you can meet single godly men, where you're growing in your walk, where you have your eyes open. You're not like, oh, I'll just be blind until the Lord hits me over the head with the man. Like there's balance. So go back and listen to that episode
That's a
too.
really good one.
The one with Candace Waters, Get Married, what single women can do to help it happen. It was a very gospel-centered conversation around this whole idea. But bringing up some of these pitfalls too, I think is really helpful.
So let's bounce back and forth our own ideas of what we think could be helpful to do if spending so much time praying and writing letters is maybe not the best idea. What are helpful things single women can do? One, I would say, absolutely, it's okay to desire marriage and to take proactive steps toward making that happen. Honestly, as a single woman,
like that means taking proactive steps. You're going to say, okay.
That actually brought me a lot of peace because I was like, okay, I'm not hiding away like under some pillow somewhere, like I'm actually really proactive about being super involved in a local singles group. Like I literally joined a co-ed Bible study of sorts in our city specifically so that I could be around more single people, so that I could put myself out there a little bit. And it was uncomfortable, I didn't know, a lot of people. I was proactive about attending conferences where I knew there would be a lot of single people, not in like a creepy way, but like, hey, I want to get married. I'm not ashamed of that desire. And so I'm going to try to build community. I'm going to get super involved in my church. I'm going to, and I hear a lot of single women who are like, my church, we just don't have any people. It's like you have to make efforts. Like you might have to travel to a conference. You might have to really initiate that in your city. Like you might have to work a little bit at this to build that kind of community. And for me, it brought a lot of comfort knowing that I wasn't, like I said, hiding under some pillow somewhere. Mm-hmm. Like I was out there, I was building community, and I could rest knowing like, okay, single men can find me, like they can see me. And if God wants to bring me a husband, he easily could. Yeah. Like I am very available, and I wasn't just there. Like I was friendly and I would talk to people. And so that's something that I would encourage you to do. And the plus side is that you gain great community. And that is something that we all should have and is so beneficial and so life-giving to have deep relationships with other, singles, with other people in your season of life. And it can be hard if you don't have that. So that's something that was super life-giving for me. And I made some amazing friendships that I still carry to this day, like other amazing godly women that I developed friendships with during that season of being involved in these different groups. And as a married woman, we're still friends. And so that's something I would really encourage you to do, is to get super involved in your church, get super involved in other groups in your city, like make those efforts, save up, travel to those conferences, because that can be extremely encouraging.
Mm-hmm. I would say, again, what we've already talked about multiple times is just growing into being a mature, godly woman yourself, because a mature, godly woman is going to attract a mature, godly man. Like oftentimes we have these lists of things that we want in a future husband, spiritual, and then just like the bonuses, like that he plays guitar and is sporty and all the outdoorsy, all these things. But are we even living up to the list that we're putting out there, right? Like on the spiritual side of things, like I want him to love the Lord and be passionate about the gospel and read his Bible every day. Let's turn that list on ourselves and really ask the Lord to examine our own hearts and say, Lord, am I pursuing these things? Like the very things I want in a godly man, because if not, then chances are a man who is all of those things might not see you. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So I would say that's really important. And then the other thing that Candace Waters actually talked about was, with the right heart posture, right? Like I have to give all the caveats that your heart is surrendered, you're trusting the Lord, you're desiring marriage. It is okay and actually a good thing to tell the people in your life, especially like godly role models, mentors, leaders in your church, to just say, hey, like I would love to get married.
Yeah.
Like I would love that. I'm praying for that. If it's the Lord's will in my life, I'm trusting him, but just letting you know, if you see or meet a godly man, I am open to you setting us up or making a connection for me or just recommending, this guy to me or me to him.
100%.
Like for godly community, and Candace was talking about this, like the church should be the place, first and foremost, where we can meet people and where godly Christian couples are inviting single people over to their home and like trying to encourage connections and relationships and even like matchmaking people in a godly way, right? And I think that could be a beautiful thing. So not being shy about your desire, expressing it to people and just saying, hey, if you see someone or you know of something or you want to have me over with that other guy from church, like I would be open to that.
Which is interesting because even as a married woman now, I recently set some people up on dates, and it didn't work out. It didn't work out with these people, but in the past, I've done that many times, and they've actually gotten married. And I remember as a single woman, I was telling people like, yes, please, if you know someone, if you got a brother, if you got a cousin, got a friend, please send them my way. And I think that is such a beautiful way to have those those, relationships happen.
Like in Christian community.
Yeah.
It's like, it is so beautiful.
So a complaint that I hear, this is kind of like my last thing. This is my last little pet peeve I've got to say about something that you should be doing. So I heard a single woman recently complaining about like, it's just so hard. Like there aren't any conservative, godly men that actually like want a conservative, godly girl. And there's just like a bunch of complaining, and other women online like, yes, this is such a problem. And then when you hear more about, so they kind of like were, this girl was sharing more about her life and just like where she's going to meet these men and what her life actually looks like. To me, it poses a lot of problems because one, she's hanging out at a lot of like bars and places like that, which I know there are classy bars. It's not all just like, wow, like weird and crazy. Like I know there are places like that where it's like, oh, you're going there, you're more classy, and it's a place where single people go to meet up. But she's going to places like that and asking like, why aren't there like conservative, godly men? Like, I don't understand why they're not, they don't want a real relationship. They just want like a hookup. And then later she revealed that she hasn't been plugged into a church. Like she's been kind of going to one. But, it's just like, oh, it's hard, and she just hasn't really gotten plugged in. And I think that is a very common story for a lot of single women, where you are going to just kind of these, cultural places where single people meet. But as a Christian woman, you're not really plugging into the places where the godly men most likely will be, And so what I would encourage you to do, which I know Candace talked a lot about, is get highly involved in a local church.
Yes.
I mean, that is the place for community. So if you have been lazy about this, if you have been like, I just don't know, or maybe you grew up at the same church, so you're just kind of there, but maybe it's not the best fit. Like maybe you need to make a switch. Maybe you need to change to a church where there is more community, where there are more people your age. Like, I don't think that's a problem. If you're like, well, all the people in my church are like 80. Well, it might be time to really explore and get plugged into a church where you can have some community at your age. Like, I think that can be a really life-giving, beautiful thing. And I just think as a single woman, ask yourself, like, when it comes to community and when it comes to God's design for church, am I living this out in a way that I truly think is healthy and good and right? Or am I just having a lot of complaints, but I'm not really putting myself in a place where, one, I could meet a godly man, but in a place where I can thrive in this season because I have that support. I have that community. So that's my biggest challenge to you. And that's the thing that absolutely changed my life and really helped me in that season, was getting highly involved in my church. And I joined Bible Study Fellowship, which BSF, I've talked about this many times. It's all over the world, literally in any country. They have these options, but there was a specific one for young adults. So it was like 18 to 40. You had to be in between that age range. You could be single or married, but I joined that just as a way to have more community on top of what I had at church and a place to put myself out there and meet people. And I just think that is a way better route than going to bars or going to like, big music festivals. I just think that if we focused more on getting involved in church, there would just be much better fruit in many ways that would come from that.
Yeah, like you want to meet a godly guy, well, be where the godly guys are.
Yeah.
Like it just makes sense. And didn't you meet your husband at church, by the way? Technically,
yeah. But like we didn't really become friends until like later on.
Yeah.
And then he did come to my church, but mostly because I was there.
Oh, well, he was like, I'm going to go to the place where the godly girl is.
He was doing the guy's version of that.
He had his eye on one, though, and he went there.
Well, and you met your husband at a Christian conference.
That's true.
So,
yeah. I mean, it's a great play. Like, and this might be so obvious to a lot of you. Like, I know that, I'm doing that, it's still not working. Like, trust the Lord.
It's not about just getting the guy.
No, it's not about getting the guy. Like, the Lord is working in your heart and your life and sanctifying you like he did for the two of us throughout even singleness, other journeys of trust that we've been on. Like, the Lord, his ultimate goal for you, remember, isn't to bring you a man and fulfill every desire you have, but to sanctify you and to grow you and to make you more like Christ so that you will be drawn into a relationship with him. He desires a personal and intimate relationship with you. And that is what's most important, whether you're single or married. Like, that is the most important thing in your life. And that's what the Lord is after in your heart, in your story, in his plan for you. And so if things aren't working out according to your timeline, you can trust him because you know that he has your good in mind, and your good is ultimately your sanctification, drawing you into a deeper relationship with him, which is what will satisfy you if you embrace that and lean in and pursue him. He is what ultimately satisfies us. So grab the book, not part of the plan, because we talk so much about trust. I mean, the whole entire book, the theme of it is trusting God with the twists and turns of your story. You share a lot about your journey of singleness. I share a lot about my journey of infertility, and each of us having these longings, these desperate longings, wanting things, children, marriage that are good and beautiful and that scripture upholds. They weren't happening in our lives. And God really brought each of us to a place in our walk with him in a heart of surrender where we were able to actually thrive and glorify God and actually love our lives even in the midst of having those unfulfilled longings, like holding all of that at the same time. Like it's just amazing the work that the Lord can do. So he wants to do that work in your heart as well. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you, grab a copy of Not Part of the Plan, and then come on over to Instagram at Girldefined, come hang out with us because we want to hear from you, especially if you're single and you've been praying for your future husband, or you're married and you did that. Like, weigh in on this conversation. We want to know, looking back, how you felt like that impacted your heart, your trust of the Lord, your view of marriage. If you're in that stage right now, what do you think about this? Like, come dialogue with us, come hang out with us over on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. And if you appreciate this conversation, conversations like this on the Girldefined show, then please head on over to Apple or Spotify, leave us a 5-star review. There are many people who hate what we do and they purposely go leave us terrible 1-star reviews on purpose to like drag our channel down. You can combat that. So if you're like, I love Girldefined, you can give us a high five and a hug by leaving that 5-star review. We see those. They're so encouraging and it helps other people find the show too. So come hang out with us on Instagram and then come back next week for another episode of the Girldefined show.